Well, hello there. So you're back with us again. And this week, what we're going to be talking about is neural communication. And so I feel the best way for me to be able to describe neural communication is really to be able to draw out these steps for you here. So that's what we're going to be doing today in class here today in this video is we're going to be drawing this out and get out a notepad here. So I think this is the best way to really understand what's taking place. So get out a pen and paper if you don't have one already. And you're probably going to want a few different colors for this. You could also be just, drawing this out if you want to, but you're going to need a few different colors. I'm going to start out with black here. And to begin with, we've been talking about with neurons, how they send an electrical signal inside the neuron. It's a chemical signal when it gets outside the neuron. So the electrical signal is really where we're going to be starting out talking a little bit about here, because that's where we started out as far as understanding how neurons communicate, is recording from them and noticing that there's this electrical message that gets sent inside the neuron. So let's draw out a neuron here. Ooh, too skinny. Draw out our neuron going out all the way to, look, there's those axon terminals at the end. There we go. We've got our neuron here. Nancy neuron. And the way we established that it's got this charge where it's more negative inside the cell relative to the outside is we're going to take our electrodes. We're going to have one electrode sitting out here outside the cell, just recording whatever the electrical charge is outside the cell. So this is an electrode, a sharp piece of, metal or whatever, maybe a glass electrode with potassium chloride inside. We're measuring the charge on the outside of the cell. And we take another electrode and we stick it into the cell. And we measure what the charge is inside the cell. And we compare what the voltage is outside from electrode 1 with the measuring of the voltage, the difference between that at electrode 2. And the difference between these right here, when we're talking about neurons, tends to be around 65 to maybe negative 70 millivolts. It does change depending on which neuron we're recording this from and which species we're doing these recordings in. But negative 70 millivolts is the number we're going to use here. And negative 70 millivolts is considered the resting membrane potential. That's the voltage that your neuron is going to be sitting at. Inside, it's going to be negative 70 millivolts more, so it's going to be 70 millivolts more negative inside the cell relative to the outside when it's just sitting there not doing anything at all. That's what the neuron's doing. And so there's going to be a few different ions involved that are helping to maintain this difference in electrical charge. And before we can continue our conversation any further, what happened there? We are going to need a key. So let's draw out a key right here. Here is our key. So there's going to be a few different ions and a few different channels that these ions are going to be going through. Let's see. So ions, we're going to make each of these ions a different color here. We're going to start out with potassium. So our potassium ions are going to be sort of this blue color here, okay? So blue color, you see a blue little circle drawn on here, that's potassium. And the periodic table of elements symbol for potassium is K+. The next ones we're going to add here are going to be sodium. Sodium will be in orange. Hello, sodium. And the periodic table of elements symbol for sodium is Na+. So that's our sodium. We've got more ions still to go here. Our next ion is going to be sort of this cool hot pink color right here. And this cute little hot pink number right here, this is chloride. So that's our chloride ions. There's one other thing we're going to add here, one other fun little circle. We're going to make it gray. And these are large proteins that are trapped inside the cell, inside the neuron. And they're large negatively charged proteins that we're going to call anions. Any ion that's got a negative charge to it is an anion. So chloride is technically also an anion. Any ion that's got a positive charge to it is considered a cation. So potassium, sodium, those are cations. But these large proteins, these large negatively charged proteins, we're just going to call them anions here. So those are our ions we're going to be working with. Now let's add in our channels. We've got about 6. We'll add 5 channels for right now. No, we'll make it 6. We'll add all of them in here. Now that way we at least know who the players are that we're going to be working with, and we've got everything organized into one spot. So we'll start with potassium, since that's the first ion we drew. Let's start with potassium's channels. So potassium has a special kind of channel only that potassium has, that's referred to as a potassium leak channel. It's called a leak channel because this is a channel, it's a door that potassium's able to fit through, and the door is always open. So potassium can come in the cell, potassium can leave the cell. It can do whatever it wants here with Nancy neuron. It can go wherever it wants, depending on how it's feeling. So that's what the leaky channel does, is it doesn't have a door. That's what makes it leaky. The next potassium channel we're going to draw out here, this one does have a door. So this one, instead of being a rectangle, it's going to be sort of these oval shapes. And it does have a door. So that's our door right there. Kind of looks like a goalpost right here in our picture. But yeah, so oval shape with that little horizontal line right there, that's our door for this channel. And this right here is a potassium voltage gated channel. Potassium voltage gated channel. So those are our potassium channels. Now let's draw out our sodium channel. So our sodium does not have a leak channel, but sodium does have a voltage gated channel. So let's draw one of those in here. So sodium voltage gated channel. Since it's a voltage gated channel, we're going to give it cool shaped ovals, just like we saw with the potassium. And it's got that door here, that gate, just like we saw with potassium. But this is our sodium voltage gated channel. All right, and potassium, we do have sodium, we do have another channel for sodium. What are we going to draw this one like? Oh, so yeah, this other channel we have for sodium, it's going to have also these ovals to it. But this is going to be a channel that allows neurotransmitters to bind. So it's got this spot right here that neurotransmitters bind onto, or potentially drugs even could bind on there. Some sort of substance binds on, and that's what opens this gate right here, what opens that door. So this is a channel, again, it allows sodium ions to flow through it. So it's a sodium channel because sodium flows through that door when it's open, but that door is shut, so it's gated. And the kind of gate it has is that it's ligand gated. Ligand, the word ligand comes from the Greek ligere, which means to bind. So a ligand is some sort of molecule that binds on, where we got this cool little goalpost thing happening. It binds on in right there. That's going to be the place where it binds. And that's what then opens this gate for the sodium ligand gated channel. So ligands, they could be neurotransmitters. They could also be drugs. All right, so those are our sodium channels. So now moving up to chloride, moving on over to chloride. And the only other channel we're going to draw for chloride is going to be a chloride. Ooh, look at that, it's oval shaped. So we already know it's going to be a gated channel, right? And this one again is also a ligand gated channel. So it's got a little door up there. This one is a chloride ligand gated channel. Ooh, I just realized I forgot one of our ions here. So I'm just going to draw it, maybe try to fit it in here a little bit. So one other ion I want to make sure we include. We're not going to get to it here in this first video, but it is going to be showing up. So you guys are going to have this as all part of your notes. This right here is calcium, which is written as Ca++ or Ca2+, is how we write calcium in the periodic table of elements. And we've got a calcium channel. So let me draw that down here. The calcium channel we'll eventually be getting to talk to is known as a, ooh, look at that, ovals. This one is not a ligand-gated channel, though. This calcium channel is a calcium Ca plus plus voltage. Gated channel. All right, so that's our key here. So let me finish drawing the outline of our key. So, so that's our key of all the things we're going to be drawing here, right? So let's zoom out here and just check this out. So here we are. We've got our neuron. We've got our various different things that are going to be involved here with what we're going to be exploring with this neuron, all written out in our key. So now our next job is we're going to get a little more close and comfortable with Nancy neuron here. We're going to go visit a little bit closer. In fact, what I want to do is I want to zoom in on her beautiful axon. So we're going to take that dashed line rectangle right there, and I'm going to zoom in on that over to here. Over here there now is where I'm going to draw what this looks like zoomed in. So just kind of draw this along right here. So we've got this layer, this what's known as actually a phospholipid bilayer that separates the outside of the cell from the inside of the cell. Because remember, it's more negative on the inside relative to the outside, right? So we got this phospholipid bilayer here. And you can tell I'm drawing that there's going to be these segments because we've got to put some channels in it, right? So draw some openings right there. And I'm going to just put all my channels probably on just that one side because we'll be talking about other stuff on this other side. So I'm just going to draw this flat, although you know in real life that it's not like that. There'll be channels on both sides of this neuron, but we're going to set this up to begin with. So this is the inside of our axon, right? So there's the axon. We're looking at the inside of it here. And first we want to draw out our ions. So going over our chart here, these are the different types of ions. So we'll start with the first one on our list, the first ion, which is potassium. Now with potassium, there is more potassium inside the neuron relative to the outside. So we're going to draw a whole lot of potassium in here inside the cell. Look at all those potassiums just hanging out, having a good old time. And there's also some potassium outside the cell, but not nearly as much as there is inside the cell. You know what I'm saying? A lot of potassium in here hanging out. And the potassium, we mentioned that there's those leak channels. So the potassium, if it wants to go out, it can anytime it wants to through one of those potassium leak channels, right? So this little potassium right here decides, you know what? There's too many other potassiums in here. I'd rather go out and visit some other friends outside. It can feel free to just go ahead and exit out anytime it wants to and go visit its other friends out there. So if it wants to, totally allowed to leave. That potassium staying in here though. All right, so that's our potassium. The next ion we had in our list was sodium. Sodium is more concentrated on the outside of the cell and less concentrated on the inside of the cell. So we're going to draw a whole lot of these orange little sodiums all hanging out here on the outside, having a good old time, hanging out on the outside. Look at all those sodiums everywhere. So much fun. And then there's a few of them inside. There are some sodiums that hang out inside, but there's not a lot of them. There's only a few of them there. All right, so those are our sodiums. Look at that. Color these in. I feel like that makes them stick out a little bit more. Sodiums. All right, what about the chloride? Chloride, come on in, chloride. So chloride is also, like sodium, it's also more concentrated on the outside of the cell relative to the inside of the cell. So we got a whole lot of chloride out here. Look at all these chlorides hanging out. Not nearly as much chloride on the inside of the cell as there is on the outside though. And if you're trying to think of an easy way to remember where there's more chloride concentrated versus where there's more sodium or more potassium, what I like to think of is French fries. So with a French fries, potato actually has potassium. Potato, potassium, potato, potassium. And with French fries, what do you put on the outside of some delicious French fries? Salt, right? And salt, table salt's made out of sodium and chloride. So if we think of our axons like being delicious little French fries, Nancy neuron's got some delicious little French fry axons. She's got more sodium and chloride on the outside of these axons and more potassium on the inside of these axons. And then of course, we've got the one other ion that we haven't drawn in here yet, which are those negatively charged proteins that hang out that are too big to fit through these doors. They just hang out on the inside here. These negatively charged proteins known as anions hanging out on the inside. There's not really any on the outside because they can't go in or out. So with the other ions, we've been drawing them on the inside, on the outside. These large anions, they're really just stuck on the inside. And they're part of what contributes to this neuron. They're the major factor of why this neuron is able to be more negative on the inside relative to the outside during resting membrane potential. All right, so those are our ions. We've drawn in our potassium leak channel, but we've got a couple other channels that exist out here on the axon. Other channels include, so we've got the leak channel. We also have potassium voltage gated channels. So this is our potassium voltage gated channel. It's got a door right there. It's not going to open that gate until there's, some potassium there that, it's at that point where it's going to be opening that gate. The voltage has reached the proper place. And there's also, we'll just draw another potassium voltage gated channel in here. Why not? A lot of doors for potassium. Sorry about that, guys. Having some technical difficulties over here on my end. We also have sodium voltage gated channels. Sodium voltage gated channels have kind of an oval shape. Wonder if I can draw another one in here. We'll just erase. Ooh, too much erasing. Can I just erase a little bit? Just want to draw up. It doesn't want to. All right, I'm just drawing it in here anyway. This is our sodium. I want to put one more on here. I want to balance it out. Balance out the sodium voltage gated channels and the potassium voltage gated channels. Oh man, now I feel like there's not enough leak channels. Let's just draw one more leak channel in here, just so that way I can feel like there's a nice balance between all of our channels, right? All right, that's fun. Okay, so we've got our ions. We've got these ions laid out. We've got our channels laid out here. There's a couple other things I want to mention to you about these axons. So as far as maintaining it being more negative on the inside relative to the outside, this is done because there's a couple of gradients. These neurons, these ions are going to be following. So there's a couple of gradients that we care about. Gradients that are going to be controlling the movement of these ions. The first gradient we're going to talk about is the concentration gradient. We'll make this a limey green color. Want this thicker. Concentration gradient. Concentration. All right, so let's talk about the concentration gradient for each one of these. So concentration gradient concentration is how much we have in each one of these places here. So with the concentration gradient, essentially our ions want to move from where they're more concentrated to where they're less concentrated. You can imagine it being sort of like, when you ride the bus, like if you were to get on a bus, if there's just one other person on the bus, it's like late at night, you're riding the bus home, there's one other person on the bus. Do you get on the bus and sit right next to that one other person in the exact same seat? No, not unless you're some kind of weirdo. Like you're going to go sit, you're going to spread, and you notice this, if you're sitting in the bus, people kind of spread out in the space that they have available. That's the same thing that our neurons are doing with their ions, is these ions want to spread out to whatever space they have available. So with potassium here, let's draw each one of these things in here, because we're going to talk about with each one of these ions, their concentration gradients. So start out with potassium. Then we're going to talk about sodium. And then lastly, we'll talk about chloride. All right, so with these concentration gradients for our potassium, it's more concentrated on the inside relative to the outside. So this force, the concentration gradient, is pushing potassium out of the cell. because there's more potassium inside the cell and there's less potassium outside the cell, potassium, based on this concentration gradient, is going to want to spread out to fill the available space, outside the cell essentially. But what keeps it from doing that, what keeps it from doing that is there's also an electrical gradient. So there's also this electrical gradient, which is sort of this darkish purple color. And the electrical gradient, essentially, have you heard the term opposites attract? Well, that is not true when we're talking about people. But when we're talking about ions, that's absolutely true. Opposites absolutely do attract. So potassium, it's more negative inside the cell, and potassium is a positively charged ion. So potassium really wants to leave the cell, the electrical gradient's really pushing potassium into the cell. It's negative inside the cell. Potassium is a positively charged ion. It's going to be pushing potassium into the cell. So you can see here, between that concentration gradient and the electrical gradient, potassium is at balance. So we can have these leak channels, like this channel right here, where potassium is more or less at balance. So it will move through here if these concentration or electrical gradient are out of whack. But because of these leak channels and because of the fact that the concentration electrical gradient are at balance, potassium just kind of stays where it is, where there's more of it inside the cell because it's negative in there. And it stays in there relative to going out of there because of that electrical charge right there balancing with that concentration gradient. All right, so with sodium, our next one here with sodium, there's more sodium inside the cell than there is outside the cell. More sodium outside the cell, more sodium outside the cell than there is inside the cell. I'm trying to keep multiple things in my mind here. More sodium outside than there is inside. So that's pushing sodium into the cell because there's more of it out there. So it wants to move into the place where it's less concentrated. There's more sodium outside, less sodium inside. So sodium wants to move in the cell where it's less concentrated. And there's also this electrical gradient, right? So there's also this electrical gradient and it's more negative inside the cell. And sodium is a positively charged ion. So that's also pushing sodium into the cell. Sodium really wants to get in there. So we can see there's a whole lot of forces pushing sodium into the cell. Let's talk about chloride here. So chloride, concentration gradient. There's more chloride outside the cell, less chloride inside the cell. So chloride wants to enter the cell based on that concentration gradient, right? There's more of a concentration outside the cell, less of a concentration inside the cell. And because of that difference in concentration, it's going to make chloride want to enter the cell. But it's more negative inside the cell, right? It's more negative inside the cell relative to the outside of the cell. And chloride is a negatively charged ion. So because of that fact, chloride is going to be forced out of the cell. It doesn't want to be in a negative environment because it's a negatively charged ion. So we can see chloride is also pretty much balanced at this resting membrane potential. So when this neuron is at rest, when it's at this negative 70 millivolts right here at resting membrane potential, we can see that with our ions then, that potassium, chloride, they're pretty happy, but sodium really wants to get in the cell. All right, so that's what's happening here. So you can see how our stage is set up. So now we're going to get looking in a little bit closer with Nancy neuron right here and what's going on at her cell body. So let's switch back in black. So here's our zoomed in rectangle that we're going to be doing here now. We're zooming in on this cell body, right? We're going to move that. We're going to move that over down over here. All right. So here is our cell body. It's going to be something like, I want to make sure I give myself a little extra room here because we're drawing in. Nancy neuron's going to have some friends talking with her. So here is weird old looking neuron right there, right? And I mentioned she's got a couple of friends. So Nancy neuron, we're going to label her neuron A. There's another neuron over here. This one. is going to be neuron B. And we're going to have another neuron over, let's put it over here. This is, you guessed it, neuron C. All right, so neuron B is going to be an inhibitory neuron. And neuron C is going to be an excitatory neuron. All right, so why don't we start with, we'll start with our excitatory neuron. So we'll start with our excitatory neuron over here, neuron C, communicating with neuron A. And we're going to want to draw in some ion channels, in particular because we're talking about an excitatory signal right here, excitatory signal coming from neuron C. We want to draw in ion channels related to an excitatory signal, which would be our sodium ligand gated channels. So let's draw in some sodium ligand gated channels over here. So in orange, sodium ligand gated channels. There's one sodium ligand gated channel. There's another goalpost right there for another sodium ligand gated channel. Maybe another one right here. It's supposed to be ovally. Forgot about that. This is an oval shape, I promise. And it's got that thing here. All right, so those are sodium ligand gated channels. And what happens is if neuron we'll say neuron C releases an excitatory neurotransmitter, like glutamate, for example. Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. So if glutamate comes along, we'll make it red, and gets released by this neuron. So we got glutamate coming out here into the synapse. When we get some of this glutamate, it binds on right here into this ligand gated ion channel. It binds over here into this ligand gated ion channel. What that means then is random sodiums that are just hanging out here. These are these sodiums that are just hanging out there in the extracellular space. Remember, there's more sodium outside the cell than there is inside the cell. So you got a lot of sodium just hanging out here with nothing to do. So when we have those ligands bind onto those ligand gated ion channels, it then allows the sodium to enter through that door on these ligand gated ion channels. Because the ligand is bound, the gate has been opened, and the sodium is able to enter the cell. Woo! So it's our sodium's going into the cell right there. So that's what happens if sodium enters the cell. And if we're recording from the cell, because remember, if we're thinking back to our electrodes right here, and over here at the beginning, we're recording what it's like inside the cell relative to the outside of the cell. If we were recording that voltage from our two electrodes, what this would look like, let's draw out this chart right here. What this would look like, I'm going to draw it here on this next page. What this would look like, this chart is going to be black. Going to have a y-axis, an x-axis. And what this chart would look like is on this y-axis, we're going to have voltage. We're measuring it in millivolts. And on this x-axis, we're going to have time in milliseconds. So we're recording from this neuron, and the neuron is at that resting membrane potential normally, which is at -70. That's what this neuron's sitting at most of the time right here, right? Just sitting there at -70 millivolts, waiting for something to happen. Now, if neuron C's released this glutamate out here, it's bound, it's allowed sodium now to enter into the cell. So now I've got sodium coming on in, sodium's moved into the cell. The sodium has a positive charge to it. It's a positively charged ion. So it's going to become less negative inside the cell, or we could say it become more positive, or it's going to be moving closer to 0 millivolts. So it's becoming depolarized. And we move up a little bit here, little bit. So it's less polar, it's less negative, it's moving closer to zero, it's becoming depolarized. So we start seeing it becoming less polar. But if it's not a lot, we don't get any other signals happening from neuron C, what'll likely happen is the neuron will reset itself back to resting membrane potential. So now we're back at -70 again, if nothing major happens here, right? Okay, so that's neuron C communicating, that's excitatory. What about this other neuron right here, neuron B, that's inhibitory? So this neuron is going to be a GABAergic neuron. So GABA, GABA, is like the prototypic inhibitory neurotransmitter. And the GABAergic neuron would be a neuron that releases GABA. So this neuron is going to be releasing these vesicles of GABA out into the synaptic space here. Let's zoom in there. Releasing some GABA out here. And we were talking about how chloride is sort of this negatively charged ion that's more populated. There's more chloride on the outside of the neuron relative to the inside of the neuron. And we need some chloride ligand-gated channels. So there's that ligand gate. Draw another one in right here, ligand gate. Maybe another one right here, why not? Ligand gate. So if we have some of this GABA bind on, ooh, wrong purple, bind on to one of these ligand gates, maybe a couple of these ligand gates, it's going to open that gate. And once that gate's been opened by that ligand, it'll allow our chloride to flow into the cell. Chloride is a negatively charged ion, right? So if we're getting more of these negatively charged ions to enter the cell, guess what? The cell's going to become more negative on the inside, or we could call that hyperpolarized. So if we're going back to our chart down here, if we were recording from this neuron and one of those GABAergic neurons released a signal and opens those chloride ligand-gated channels, and chloride flows into the cell, what we would expect to see is the cell become hyperpolarized or more negative. So it moves more away, farther away from zero. So it becomes even more negative. It becomes much less likely it'll send a signal because it's gotten even more negative. But if nothing happens after that, it will slowly move back up to resting membrane potential because the neuron will reset itself if nothing else occurs. So basically what happens right there. But if we have enough excitatory signals coming in, from sodium ligand-gated channels, and it becomes positive enough, these charges are going to fill up the cell body. So it's going to become more positive everywhere in the cell body. Now remember, these are going to be moving from a more negative, from this more positive environment towards a more negative environment. They're going to be moving from where it's more concentrated to where it's less concentrated. So you can imagine they're all eventually going to be moving this direction towards this portion of the neuron, which we've talked about before. It's referred to as the axon hillock. Axon hillock. And at the axon hillock, that's where the decision, as far as whether or not to fire the neuron, that's where the decision's made. And we say that because what happens is right here at the axon hillock, we've got voltage-gated sodium channels hanging out, a whole lot of voltage-gated sodium channels. So remember, these voltage-gated sodium channels, they're gated. That's what that gated part of the name means, which means they're not going to open their door unless the cell hits the right kind of voltage. So we've got all these voltage-gated sodium channels hanging out, waiting for the cell to hit the right voltage. So we're thinking back to our chart right here, and we're thinking about our excitatory neuron. If it allows enough of this sodium to enter, that the cell becomes depolarized, right? It's becoming depolarized. And right about, let's say like right here is negative, we're going to say it's -55. So depending on the book you're reading, sometimes it's -55, sometimes it goes as low as -45, but it's sort of what this is right here is considered threshold. This is the threshold voltage right here that the neuron needs to make it to. So -55 in our example right here This is threshold. So if the neuron's becoming depolarized, and it hits this threshold value, what makes it the threshold is that it's once the cell hits this negative 55 millivolts, that then these sodium voltage gated channels open. So these channels open when the cell becomes negative 55 millivolts or more positive than that number. So if it gets even more positive, negative 55, it'll also open those channels. And if we think back, we're thinking back to sodium, this right here. Remember those charges? It's got this concentration gradient that wants sodium to go in. It's got this electrical gradient that wants sodium to get in. So sodium really wants to get in here. Sodium really wants inside the cell. So we open these voltage gated sodium channels. You'll never guess what happens. Sodium comes rushing into the cell through these channels, like huge amounts of sodium, tons of sodium, tons rushing in. And so that's what leads to this action potential, where at that point, once we hit that threshold, that's when things get really interesting. And that's when we get this action potential. All of those sodium ligand gated channels open up and we get this huge spike happening right here. So the cell moves past 0 all the way up to somewhere around like positive 40 millivolts up here. So plus 40 millivolts here with all these sodium channels opening. So this right here with the sodium channels opening, this right here, this huge bump up, this represents sodium V gated. I'm writing V gated for voltage gated. Sodium V gated channels open here. Channels open. And then we have this rapid fall that takes place right afterward over here. Just as it gets to the peak, we have these voltage gated channels open, and then they start shutting right as we start hitting this peak. And then after that, the cell rapidly drops in voltage. You get this rapid drop in voltage for this refractory period, and it kind of resets after that. So as we're nearing this peak, the sodium voltage gated channels are going to close and the potassium voltage gated channels are going to open right here. So potassium V gated channels open. So we have on this upswing right here, this is sodium rushes in, right? And now on this other side here, we got these potassium voltage gated channels opening, right? So if we think back, thinking back to our potassium here, we're thinking back to our potassium. There's more potassium inside the cell relative to the outside. So it's more concentrated on the inside. And now if we think about where we're at with our voltage right here, it's really positive inside the cell. So there's more potassium inside the cell. It's really positive inside the cell. So both the concentration gradient, because there's more potassium inside than outside, and the electrical gradient, because it's more positively charged now inside the cell relative to the outside, both of these forces are really pushing potassium to want to leave the cell. So once we open these potassium voltage gated channels, potassium rushes out. And so that's what we're seeing with this dramatic drop right here that takes place. In this refractory period, what happens is we mentioned that the sodium channels, they're going to be closing as we're reaching this peak right here. And as we're getting to this dip right here, potassium channels are going to be closing. So no voltage gated channels are open at this point right here, at that refractory period right here. Refractory period. No voltage gated channels are open, so it can't send a signal no matter what, no matter how much it wants to, it's unable to send a signal. All right, so I'm going to go ahead. We're going to stop this video here. We're going to pick up with this story in the next video, but I wanted to at least kind of provide you with this framework for how we're going to be looking at this here, going from our neuron, looking at the axon, seeing how the concentration gradients are set up at the axon, then going over here next, looking at communication happening to this neuron and how it's leading ultimately to this action potential. So in the next video, I'm going to pick up right here where we're at as well. But what I'm going to do is kind of continue along with these steps, and we'll go ahead and do a little refresher at the beginning. So we'll go ahead and conclude right here and pick back up in the next videos. Thanks for hanging out, guys. I will see you again in the next video.